I'll turn to education and to Charlotte Holland, Associate Professor, the Institute of Education, Dublin City University. Charlotte, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. McGann. Very pleased to be part of the panel this afternoon. How can we build effective education systems that respond to pandemics? And to begin, I just wanted to start by setting the context for some of the things that have been happening that have been quite challenging over the last number of months within the context of education. So we know that the pandemic has disrupted or halted academic studies across the globe. Back in April, UNESCO estimated that in the region of 1.5 billion learners were out of school. So they were affected by the school closures. That constitutes over 90% of the school-age population of learners and close to 100% of those in tertiary settings. To support students during these closures, many schools and tertiary education institutions pivoted to delivering education through distant modes of learning, mainly using, for example, the internet, television, radio. And a key issue there, almost immediately felt by many people, was the issue of a lack of universal access to the broadband, the Wi-Fi technologies, or indeed the computer infrastructure that's needed to support learning, for example, through the internet. In addition to this, using television and radio, it doesn't necessarily lead to quality learning. They're broadcast media. The degree to which you can interact with learning that is being communicated through the television or through radio is much more limited than that which you would experience in a school setting or using web technologies. Again, concerns were raised about the inadequate training and preparation of both educators and learners for learning across mixed modes of learning. So this transitioning from engaging in learning in an in-school context and then moving beyond that to engaging remotely, teachers really weren't prepared for that. Teaching through technology is very different to teaching with technology. And what we noticed almost immediately was that the professional development that we provide our teachers with is primarily focused on the latter. In other words, it was focused very much on how to use technology to facilitate learning. Therefore, teachers weren't appropriately trained in how to communicate through this new medium. And that in itself is a significant challenge and something that we need to look to as we move forward. Other issues that emerged over the last couple of months, and some of those much longer, are issues of e-safety, but particularly online. We've had cases where meetings, there have been breaches of security, for example, during online learning classes and so on. And teachers and parents have real concerns about the privacy, about protecting privacy and e-safety of children. On top of this, many parents had to engage in remote working, and with children in the home, that became quite difficult to manage. Parents were expected now not only to work in the home, but also to act in loco teachers, in place of teachers. And some parents were able to, for example, facilitate that. Some had the skill set to do that. However, many parents didn't, and the different levels and quality of support from parents in the home inevitably result in very different learning experiences. So unfortunately, the evidence that's emerging is pointing to significant learning losses, particularly for those who are already experiencing disadvantage. Furthermore, it's important to note that schools are not just a locus of learning. They are spaces where children and young adults come together to socialize. They are places where children sometimes get fed. And the disruption to the delivery of in-school education has disrupted those other processes that happen within the context of schools. And the World Bank, for example, estimated that 360 million children were impacted by the disruption to the school's nutrition program globally, and are also very concerned about, particularly about girls and young women who may be suffering from mental health and well-being issues because they're in isolation and suffering hardship in the home. In addition to this, parents, educators, and educational providers were concerned, and have some concern still, about the lack of preparedness for the return to school, for this transitioning back towards in-school or in-person education. So they're concerned about inadequate protocols in place to ensure the health and safety of their children, and the resourcing that's needed to appropriately protect the health and well-being of all. And finally, as we look forward, there are concerns about, obvious concerns about the finances of governments as we move forward. There are likely to be issues in maintaining public funding of education. And within that context, we need to look to see where priorities may be made. So in summary, the issues that I want to speak about in terms of addressing are these issues of unequal access to technology, the lack of readiness of teachers, learners, school systems for remote education, the learning losses, the health and safety concerns, and the financial uncertainty at all school levels as we move forward. So the brief that myself and my co-authors, which is Dalal Al-Dagheether, Abdul Ghaffar Mughal, and Mohammed Nuran Abi, we put this together. It was published last Friday. This particular brief highlights 8 recommendations for the G20 as we move forward to build effective education systems, to build back better systems that are more responsive in times of need, such as pandemics. And the first recommendation is really the most obvious. And Dr. McGann noted in his summary at the very beginning, he talked about the acceleration, the need to accelerate particular actions as we move forward. The very first action we need to accelerate is universal access to broadband and technology, because remote schooling or remote education using web technologies or internet-based technologies cannot happen unless there is appropriate access to broadband and other technologies. We also need to remember that non-technological solutions can be very useful as well. So we need to think in advance about how to place learning resources within communities that can be distributed in times of need. As governments, we need to implement action plans to manage transitions and continuity of learning beyond the classroom. And some suggestions for within the action plan include accelerated training for teachers at all levels on how to engage in quality teaching, learning, and assessment at a distance. And part of this process will involve looking at the content that we're currently delivering, and certainly at a governmental level, to see what aspects of the curriculum could be curated, could be perhaps emphasized, what aspects could be set aside during emergency transitions to remote learning, and also examine whether we could build micro modules to support basic education, basic literacy and numeracy, and micro credentials to go with those. We also need seriously to look at the issue of assessment. We've seen the drama and some disasters in not being able to run high stakes exams at the end of, in the past couple of months. The UK had particular difficulties there. Here in Ireland, we also had our challenges. So the challenge is that teachers are flying blind unless they can get some feedback loop to understand how learners are performing while they're engaging in remote education. So we need to look at curricula, we need to seriously look at assessment and think about how continuous assessment could be introduced so that learners can so that feedback relay is there. Also importantly, we need to support parents. If this continues, if home is to be a site of learning, we need to seriously consider providing advice and support for parents in the broad domain of care, stimulation, play, enabling learning within the home. This has been called upon by UNICEF amongst others. And just coming up to the final points here, we need to look at how we can provide better training on e-safety. We need to look to see how we can provide mental health supports for our learners. And just a final point I want to make is that a key learning from this pandemic is that access to in-person, in-school education is important. Therefore, we must strive to keep schools open as soon as the local transmission of a COVID pandemic or other disaster is under control. The alternative, according to the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, is a generational catastrophe where gains in expanding access to quality education are likely to be stalled or reversed. And that's something that we really do not want to let happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte, very much. Just two quick questions. One is that most school districts, most systems are large, bureaucratic, and not agile. And COVID obviously has posed a challenge for all institutions to be more agile and responsive. And then secondly, the issues around how kids now receive information is fundamentally different, largely digital, and the sort of mismatch between the lack of preparedness of most of the school districts in terms of how to train, how to provide teachers with the skills to teach online, even though this has been the transformation of how information and learning transmitted has been in play for a number of times. And as I've said previously, it's the big accelerator. So is it possible, I mean, in terms of now an environment now and in the future, where school districts will have to be much more adaptive, much more agile and responsive and resilient? Are they capable of that? And two, how do we get teachers? And I get feedback from my daughter and my students about disasters in terms of online learning. And so how do we really make this radical transformation given the lack of agility and responsiveness of most school systems?
Okay, thank you for two very interesting and important questions. I think I'll deal with the latter first, if I may, and that is, you know, how do we get teachers acclimatized to using digital technologies in their teaching and learning, but also comfortable and use them appropriately in terms of remote learning. The key there, I think one important advantage we have now is that I would imagine most teachers now have at least had the experience of engaging with learners online. The fact that that experience may not have been a quality one is sad for the learners, but nevertheless, it gives us something as, for example, teacher educators, anyone involved in teacher professional development, it gives us a basis from which we can build up a skill set. So I think part of the solution here is that we work with what teachers have experienced. We now know they can access Zoom, and they do understand the challenges, you know, of engaging learners in an online mode. So I think really it's up to the higher education sector, the government, the ministries of education and countries to look at what's there, to examine it critically, and to start really accelerating in-service teacher education programs to show teachers how to do this very quickly. In Ireland, they're doing some of that through professional development service. They're already out there delivering in schools through Zoom, and they're finding that their classes are full. All teachers are signing up for it. I imagine that is the case in other countries. In terms of the bureaucratic nature of school districts, I think that is a problem. But I have watched here in Ireland, we have less of a problem with that bureaucracy at a local level here in Ireland, because a lot of our schools are autonomous, you know, and so we have a good degree of control. But we have other structures that have in the past been quite bureaucratic. And what we've noticed is that the learning in having to respond quickly over the last 6 months has definitely translated into much more effective communication and management systems. So I would be hopeful that the learning that all ministries, government departments have had, which translates into the administration in school districts, that learning would enable them to see that we don't have the time to wait for them to catch up. Certainly digital technologies would be useful in that, digital training for administrators and those involved in decision making. But ultimately, it's something we would have to work on together.
Thank you very much.